Foodborne illnesses are on the rise, and much of it is due to fresh produce. In the 1970s, about 1% of the foodborne illnesses was due to fresh produce, and the CDC now predicts 46% will be due to produce. That's a huge increase. Now, there are several factors for this, but I think one of the main ones is that there's so much misinformation about food and food safety out there. In this video, I'm going to give you 15 food safety myths that you really should know. Quite literally, it could save your life. Myth number 1, unsafe food smells bad. The idea is that you can simply sniff your food and you can tell if it's off. That's simply not true. The microorganisms that make you sick don't make food smell bad. That's a different kind of microorganism. The ones that make food smell bad don't really harm you very much. But it is true that if microbes have invaded your food and it starts smelling bad, there's a good chance that the pathogens that make you sick are also in the food. So it's a good idea to throw that food out. But you can't detect pathogens by smell. Myth number 2, foodborne illnesses happen quickly, usually a couple hours after you eat the bad food. Well, that's simply not true. It is true that most foodborne illnesses will happen within 3 days of eating the bad food, but it can happen as fast as 20 minutes, or it could take 6 weeks. Once you feel sick, it's impossible to know which food caused the illness. Myth number 3, foodborne illnesses isn't a big deal. Alright, so you feel uncomfortable, you might even get a little sick, but it passes and you're okay again. Well, that's true for most people, but foodborne illnesses can be deadly and they can produce lasting medical problems. About 3,000 Americans die from foodborne illnesses every year. It is something you have to take seriously. Myth number 4, you can't catch foodborne illnesses from other people. Well, that's not always true. One example is hepatitis A. You can catch this from other people through fecal-oral transmission. Now that's exactly like it sounds. Someone hasn't washed their hands properly, and part of their poop is being spread all over the place, and that can spread hepatitis A. Now, you might think this is a rare occurrence, but it's actually more common than you think. Myth number 5, washing produce with a soapy solution makes the food safe. That's not true. First of all, the soap you're probably using is the dish soap, and that dish soap is really a detergent. And most soap and detergents are not safe to eat. Not only that, but soap does not remove pathogens any better than plain running water. When you're washing your produce, just use water. And by the way, don't use those commercial products either. They're not as good as using water. Myth number 6, washing produce makes it pathogen-free. It makes it safe to eat. Well, that's only partly true. Washing that produce is a good idea because it does remove pathogens, but it doesn't remove all of them. When a bacteria attaches to food, it actually makes a biofilm. This is kind of a safety layer on that food, and the bacteria live inside of that. And immediately it starts replicating. So in a very short period of time, you have a whole bunch of bacteria all living in this protected biofilm. And that biofilm sticks to food very tightly. And for that reason, it's actually very hard to wash those bacteria off of produce. Some of these bacteria in the biofilm can even withstand chlorinated water washes. And chlorine is toxic to those bacteria, but the biofilm protects them. The other reason washing isn't as effective as you might think is that a lot of these microbes can actually go inside the food. We think that this food is a solid surface, but it actually has lots of little holes. And some of these microbes go through those holes into the inside of the produce. This happens even more often when there's damage to that produce. So if you have a cut or a bruise, then it's even easier for those microbes to get inside the food. And once inside, they're protected by the food, and no amount of washing is going to get them out. Myth number 7. Peeling produce removes the pathogen. Lots of people think that the pathogens are only on the outside, so if we remove the skin, we've gotten rid of the pathogen. And that's true for the most part. But there's a problem with peeling. Each time you make a cut in that produce, you push microbes from the surface down into the tissue below the cut. And the cut damages that tissue. And so the microbes now have an easy time getting inside the produce. It turns out that peeling doesn't really reduce the amount of pathogen. Now, we do want to peel some types of food, like carrots, for instance. And if you're going to peel things, it's a good idea not to peel them until immediately before either eating them raw or cooking them. You don't want to peel the food, let the microbes get inside and start to grow inside. Myth number 8, organic produce has more pathogen. Now, some of you might think it's the other way around, but the common thinking is that organic production of food uses more manure. And manure, we know, has lots of pathogens in it. So if you farm with a lot of manure, you can expect more pathogens on the food. There have only been a few studies that have compared conventional to organic farming and looked at the pathogen levels. And in general, they find very little difference between the two. What's more important is the actual procedures that the farmers are using. Both conventional and organic farms use manure. If that manure is heavily composted, you have less pathogens in it. If that manure is applied to the soil several weeks before planting, you also have less pathogens on the food. It's the way you use the manure that's the issue, not whether you are organic or conventional. In this regard, organic and conventional food are equally safe, but both can have pathogens on them. The other factor that's important is the type of produce being grown. It seems like leafy greens are some of the worst sources for pathogens. And a lot of that has to do with the way the leafy greens are handled, both during production and post-production. An issue with pathogens happens because of the way we actually process that food between the farm and your table. Myth number 9, pesticides kill pathogens. So some people feel that it's safer to eat conventional food rather than organic food. The reason is that conventional food is made with pesticides, and those pesticides are harmful chemicals, so they kill pathogens. Well, there are a couple myths in this idea. The first one is that both conventional and organic agriculture use pesticides. They're just different types of pesticides. And the conventional pesticides are not necessarily more harmful to pathogens, or to humans for that matter. The second point is that many of the pesticides we use are not harmful to microbes. In fact, many of them are a food source for microbes. Take Roundup, for instance. I mean, people hate this. They think Roundup kills everything. Well, the active ingredient in there is glyphosate, and it turns out that there are bacteria that eat glyphosate. It's a food source for them, and that's why the level drops in soil. Glyphosate also has a very specific reaction that really only bothers plants. It doesn't harm most microbes. There's another thing to consider here, that the actual spraying process may be spreading the pathogens. I mean, what farmers do is they take a big tank of water and they put a concentrated amount of pesticide in there, they dilute it, and then they spray it on their fields. That water is not potable water. It's not pathogen free. So now that water with the pesticide in it is being sprayed on all the produce. And if that water is contaminated with pathogens, the spraying process is actually spreading the pathogens. This has actually been identified as a real problem, and the governments are in the process of putting in regulations about how long you can keep that material stored in the tanks. Because the longer you store it, the more pathogens grow in those tanks. Myth number 10, vegetarians don't have to worry about food poisoning. The thinking goes something like this. Most of our food poisoning is due to animals, meat, chicken, eggs. Those get contaminated and give us food poisoning? Well, it turns out that we get food poisoning just as often from non-meat products. All those vegetables and fruits, particularly the leafy greens, are giving us soil-borne illnesses. This is not a meat problem. So vegetarians probably have a higher chance of getting foodborne illness because the meat is actually pretty safe in most cases. Myth number 11, freezing food kills bacteria. Well, that's just simply not true. Bacteria are mostly active at room temperature, and as the temperature drops, they do slow down. They slow down their metabolism, and they slow down in their reproduction, so there's less of them. As we go to freezing, that activity slows way down, but it doesn't kill most bacteria. That frozen food in your freezer is just a popsicle made out of bacteria. Now, what happens when you defrost that food? Well, as the temperature comes up, the bacteria get warmer. The food usually has liquids coming out of it. Those juices come off of it, and that's perfect bacteria food. That's one reason you should never defrost your food on your kitchen counter. You want to defrost it either quickly or at lower temperature. So two good options is to leave it in the fridge and defrost it there. At the fridge temperature, bacteria are not very active. The other option is to put it into cold water. In cold water, it unfreezes quite quickly. And as soon as it's unfrozen, put it back in the fridge until you're ready to cook it. Myth number 12, microwaving kills bacteria. Well, that's also not true. The thing that kills bacteria is the heat. So if we microwave food and it gets hot enough, it does start killing off bacteria. But the problem with microwaving is that some parts of the food get really hot and other parts stay cold. You don't get even heating with microwave. So you might kill some bacteria in one spot, but you're just warming up the others in a different spot. So microwaving is not a good way to get rid of pathogens unless you get the food really good and hot. Myth number 13, food can be left at room temperature. Bacteria grow rapidly in the temperature danger zone, which is between 40 and 140 degrees Fahrenheit. This is when bacteria are the most active. Food left at room temperature for more than 2 hours should be discarded. If you're outside and the temperature is 90 degrees Fahrenheit or hotter, food should be discarded after just 1 hour. This can be important to remember if you're preparing food for a tailgate party or a picnic. Myth number 14, the 5-second rule. You've heard this before. If you have some food and you drop it on the floor, as long as you pick it up within 5 seconds, it's good to eat. Well, that's not really true. It turns out when food hits the floor, bacteria start to stick to the food. Now, the longer it's there, the more bacteria are picked up by the food. But even 5 seconds is enough to pick up quite a few bacteria. The time is really not the important thing. It's the type of food that's important. Food that is sticky or wet picks up more bacteria than dry food. But in both cases, if you drop food either on the floor or even on the kitchen counter, consider that it's covered in bacteria. You should wash that food before you either cook it or eat it fresh. Myth number 15, moldy food is safe to eat. Well, it might be or it might not be. That fluffy mold that you see is the top part of the organism. Remember, mold has a root-like structure underneath that goes into the food. And those roots are producing a toxin. Some of those toxins will make you sick. Others, in fact, are beneficial. Penicillin is one of those chemicals that molds make, and it is okay to eat. But you don't know by looking at the mold whether it's producing toxins or safe chemicals. Now, in some cases, the food can get moldy, and it's actually really good to eat. The flavor of some of our cheeses, like brie, is there because of the mold that's growing on the cheese, and eating it won't harm you. But in general, it's not a good idea to eat moldy food. Just toss the whole thing out. There you have it, my 15 myths about food safety. Now, if you'd like to learn about organic food myths, have a look at this video right here.